What is the best Disney Lorcana deck in 2025? My name's Spessy, and I'm here to answer that very question, as well as tell you which decks you should probably avoid, and which decks I think are underrated and have some huge potential. But why should you listen to what I have to say? Well, I play a lot of Disney Lorcana, and honestly, I watch it even more. I watch many of the top players, as I am a commentator for the pro events of Disney Lorcana Challenge. I was recently in Disneyland Paris for the European Championships, and I watched so much Lorcana that weekend. I spoke to so many of the top players, and I think I've got a really good understanding of which decks are doing great right now. Added to that, deck building is my biggest strength, I would say, as a Lorcana player, and I have spent so many hours compiling the best lists for every single color combination that I was able to find, as well as a lot of them being built by myself. So I hope you enjoyed the video. A lot of work's gone into it. Give it a like if you like it, and make sure to subscribe. Most of my viewers aren't subscribed, and I'd really appreciate pressing that subscribe button. It is free, doesn't cost you anything, and it makes me feel happy. Big shout out to Card Market, who sponsor the channel. It's a great place to buy singles online in Europe. Without any further ado, we're starting off with the classic. It's the Hyper Aggro. Daisy Duck and Goat representing it. Hyper Aggro can be built in a bunch of different ways, but the general idea is get as much lore as quickly as you possibly can. I have played a lot of Hyper Aggro over the years, and in fact, it's the deck which I played the most of in the first couple of sets, and I have some pretty strong opinions on how it should be built. The key thing really is that your turn 2, you're not ideally playing a 2-cost character. One of the most powerful things to do in Lorcana recently is on turn 2, play 2 1-drop characters. This is giving you a wide board, and it makes it difficult for your opponent to answer all of your questing threats at once. Added to that, Befuddle is a really strong play on turn 2 alongside another 1-drop. For example, you could play Daisy Duck on turn 1, and then on turn 2 play another Daisy Duck and a Befuddle to bounce back either the 1-cost or 2-cost character to your opponent's hand, which gives you a really big lead in terms of board presence in the early game. This is going to help you eke out more lore and get closer to that 20 mark, hopefully crossing the finish line with cards like Merlin Goat and the White Rose. There's a lot of interesting options that you could play which aren't in my deck lists. Things like Baloo, Donald Duck, Tiana Restaurant Owner are all great options, but ultimately, there's so many strong cards in Amethyst that it's difficult to fit everything. One thing I would always do is never go near cutting any of these 1-cost characters. They are really, really strong, as well as the Madam M Snakes and Fox to re-ready your cards like Lilo, Maleficent, and Daisy to get that extra lore. I think that Hyper Aggro is probably the most underrated deck in Disney Lorcana, and if you're someone that's not that confident, it can be a great deck to play. If you can master Hyper Aggro, you have less decisions to make over the course of a game because the games are shorter, but what that also means is each play you make is more important. So if you can get to a place where you're really confident with Hyper Aggro, I think this deck is a lot better than people realize. Many of the top players avoid playing Hyper Aggro decks because you have less agency, because the games are shorter, you have less choices to make. Hyper Aggro is viewed by many as a deck to play if you're a noob, but I don't think that's really fair, and I think that a good Hyper Aggro player can absolutely beat many of the top decks in the metagame. I do genuinely think it's the most underrated deck in the game. As a result, I'm going to be tempted to put it into the C tier or the D tier. I think most people would put it down in the D tier, but I'm actually going to bump it up controversially into the C tier because I think it's a lot better than people realize. I really, really do. It's a deck I like a lot, and I think it has potential to win some tournaments. Up next, we have Amber and Emerald Discard. Amber Emerald Discard won a Disney Lorcana Challenge at the end of Set 5, but it didn't get that many new tools for Set 6, and it is struggling a little bit. Having said that, it's still a very strong deck, with one of the strongest openers in the game. It's looking to utilize Diablo and shift in Diablo as early as possible, and then play Prince John on turn 3, play You Have Forgotten Me, and maybe Sing Sudden Chill on turn 4 to discard your opponent's entire hand while refilling your own, and then a well-timed Under the Sea to wipe your opponent's board and slowly quest to victory. When it achieves this early combo, there are few decks better than it. However, it is relatively inconsistent, and usually Emerald Steel is a preferred option to it. I do have a feeling, though, that this deck might be better than people realize right now. Because Emerald Steel has gone out of the metagame a little bit, this deck really does struggle against Emerald Steel decks. Emerald Steel is able to sing Let the Storm Rage On with Diablo, whereas this deck is able to sing Bare Necessities with Diablo, which is able to, for example, discard your opponent's Brawl. It can mean that the Diablo is really difficult to answer, and its weakest matchup is Emerald Steel, which is less popular in the current metagame. So I have another hot take that this deck might be quite underrated. I'm going to go ahead and put it into the top of the C tier, above the Hyper Aggro deck, but it's definitely one which I think you could experiment with and have some success with. Up next, we have Amber Ruby Mufasa, or as I like to call it on this channel, Boofasa. It's a bit of a random joke from my channel from way back when, because a lot of Mufasa players love to play Mufasa and get very offended when I've called it bad in the past. Well, guess what? Mufasa, or should I say Boofasa, is worse than ever. It's going straight into the F tier. It's just not a very good deck, to be completely honest with you. Having said that, I do think that Amber Ruby is a really fun color combination, and it's definitely a deck you can have a lot of fun with and still have success with. Even the decks in the F tier, I think, are super capable of winning your local tournaments like set championships, but I think Amber Ruby would have no chance at winning a Disney Lorcana challenge, which is why I'm putting it down in the F tier. It is also worth mentioning that Ruby Amber with the latest set got a lot of support for the Sugar Rush Speedway location deck, and that is a deck I've played a lot of and I really enjoy it, but unfortunately it's just not that competitive. It feels like it's missing a few pieces of the puzzle, but that's definitely something to keep your eye on moving forward. Mother Gothel plus Rapunzel is a really, really strong combination in Amber Ruby, and I do think that this color combination will continue to get stronger moving forwards, but right now I would avoid it. I really, really would. But if you have fun with Mufasa, it's really not that bad. It's just one of the weaker decks in the game right now. Up next, we have Amber Sapphire. Amber Sapphire has historically been straight into the F tier, but honestly, it got quite a bit better recently with cards like Alice, and you've got the Daisy Duck as well, which came out a set ago, and some other really interesting plays that you can make. I commentated a tournament in France last year where this deck performed really well, and the deck that you're seeing on screen was built by Theatim, who is a Disney Lorcana Challenge champion from France. He took this deck in the NA versus EU tournament and did pretty well with it. So I think that this deck has some legs and is a very interesting option. I have to say, if I had to pick between a Hyper Aggro Amber Amethyst deck or a Hyper Aggro Amber Sapphire deck, I would personally lean still more towards the Amber Amethyst. I think both of these decks are pretty similar in power though, and are both underrated decks. I'm going to put them both into the C tier, but I think there's also a world that they could both go into the D tier as well. But for now, I'm going to put them up into the C tier. I think they're better than people realize. I really think these aggro decks are much better than you'd think, because a lot of the top pro players don't like playing them for big tournaments. Now, the next two decks are actually the same color combination, and it's the only color combination which I wanted to include two different versions of, and that's because they're both really, really top meta contenders. This color combination is Amber Steel, and they are quite similar. One of them is a more traditional Amber Steel deck with Aerial and a Whole New World, and the other one is a more modern take on Amber Steel songs, which ditches the Whole New World in favor of using Dock for card draw. And these are two of the top decks in the metagame. Both of these are going to be either in A tier or B tier. Note we don't have an S tier currently, because I think there's a lot of really, really strong decks. For me, I'm going to go ahead and put the traditional... Do you know what? I think I'm putting them both into the A tier. I think they're both going into the A tier. Personally, I prefer the aggro take on songs a little bit more at the moment. I think it just fits into the metagame a little bit better. But both are really, really strong decks and are both very much top meta contenders. You've got Cinderella in both decks, which is able to sing things like Let the Storm Rage On and Strength of a Raging Fire, and both decks have really strong card draw, with the Amber Steel aggro deck having Dock and Aerial, a Whole New World being such a powerful combo. Both of these decks deserve to go into the A tier, and you really can't go wrong with Amber Steel songs. It is an ever-present, it's been meta since the first set of Disney Lorcana, and it will continue to be a top meta deck moving forward. If you're looking for a more budget-friendly version of Amber Steel songs, you're probably going to be more interested in the aggro setup, because cards like Aerial and A Whole New World came in the first chapter and can be a little bit more hard to get your hands on. So if you're looking for a more budget-friendly version, I would suggest the aggro songs version as well. Now up next, we've got the Amethyst decks, and I decided to pair all of the Amethyst decks together in a single swoop. They're not necessarily going to be in the same tier, but I wanted to talk about them all at the same time. Basically, that's because Amethyst just has so many strong cards. Amethyst as an ink color is the single strongest color in the game right now, simply because there's like 40, maybe 50 cards in Amethyst, which are incredibly powerful. And then you can just pick your 10 favorite cards from a different color combination. So while I don't have Amber Amethyst mid-range in this list, I think it really is not a bad deck by any stretch of the imagination. The first one we're going to look at specifically is going to be the Emerald Amethyst deck, which recently got second place at the Disney Lorcana European Championships, and it could have won the finals, frankly. I think it was some slight misplays from Michele, who was playing Amethyst Emerald in the final, which ended up costing them. For me, it is a top contender of best deck in the game. I'm going to put it above the Amber Steel decks. Gogo Tamago is a huge centerpiece card in this color combination now. With Elsa and with the Fox, you can get a lot of damage counters onto your opponent's cards, and Gogo is often gaining you 4 or 5 lore in a single swoop, which can be absolutely incredible. Another thing that I like about Emerald Amethyst is I do think it's one of the stronger Amethyst decks in the Amethyst mirror matchups. The Amethyst mirror matchups are really about board control, fight, and presence, and the Emerald deck has a nice range where it can go underneath Ruby Amethyst, which means it can be a bit quicker than Ruby Amethyst, but then against the other Amethyst decks, you can play a little bit more slowly and then finish the game in explosive style with the Gogo Tamago. So I think that Emerald Amethyst is what most people would consider the strongest Amethyst deck. I think a lot of people would argue it's Ruby Amethyst, and that is supported by the fact that Ruby Amethyst won the Lorcana Challenge European Championships in Paris. But as I mentioned, having watched that final back many times and having casted the final in person, I have to say that Emerald Amethyst should have won that tournament, and I do think that it is better than Ruby Amethyst, which is up next. I'm going to go ahead and put Ruby Amethyst below the Amber Steel songs. I know, Ruby Amethyst players, you're not going to be happy with me. Ruby Amethyst is a great deck, and I think in the right hands, it's really, really solid. But for me, it is outshined by the Emerald Amethyst deck. Do you know what? I was almost tempted to put it into the B tier, because I do think it's just worse than some of the other Amethyst decks here, but it deserves its place in the A tier. You can't go wrong with Ruby Amethyst, and again, if you're looking to invest in a deck, these Amethyst cards are really, really good across the board in so many different decks. Ruby Amethyst, of course, has that little bit of extra control with cards like Be Prepared, and it's a great, great deck. The reason I think it's one of the weaker Amethyst decks for now is because it's quite slow compared with something like Emerald Amethyst. It tends to have a slight disadvantage in those mirror matchups, particularly when going second, it can get overwhelmed quite quickly by decks like Amethyst Steel and Emerald Amethyst. So I think that Ruby Amethyst is one of the top decks in the game. It's going to continue to be really, really strong and have a lot of people playing it. It did have an incredible record at the Disney Lorcana European Championships, but for me, I would play quite a few other Amethyst decks before I would ever consider playing Ruby Amethyst. Up next, we've got Blurpool, as it's known, which is Sapphire Amethyst, and I think this is another one of the most underrated decks in Disney Lorcana. What's really interesting about this one is you can play Tipo, One Jump Ahead, or Sail the Azurite Sea on turn 2, which is going to allow you to play a Genie on turn 3, an Elsa on turn 4, and then shift to Elsa on turn 5. And that is an absolutely devastating combo. I have a feeling that this deck is quite underrated at this moment in time and probably performs quite well in Amethyst mirrors. I mean, I can say for myself, I played against Earlmeister and he was playing a Sapphire Amethyst deck and I lost to him 2-1. And I was pretty impressed by how the deck performed. It's not represented as much, and I think therefore it can never go into the A tier, but I am going to put it into the B tier. I think a lot of people was going to be expecting me to put it C or even lower, but I think this deck's got serious legs. I think Amethyst is the best color in the current metagame by a quite large distance, and for me, I think you can't really go wrong with Amethyst decks and just put in 10, 12 other cards. And in this case, it's going to be your Tipo, it's going to be your Sail, the Azurite Sea. Genie on 3 into Elsa on 4 is going to win you so many Amethyst mirrors. Up next, we got my favorite deck of the season. It's Amethyst Steel, and you're probably not going to be surprised to see that I'm going to put it as the best deck in the game. I have felt that it's the best deck in the game as soon as the set released, and my opinion has not changed whatsoever. The reason I think it's the best deck in the game is because I think Amethyst is the best color, and I think that Amethyst Steel is the strongest Amethyst deck in the Amethyst mirror matchups. Now, some people might debate this because I think that Emerald Amethyst also is very much in with a shout in that department. But I think that the power of Amethyst Steel is that you can play Fire the Cannons and Befuddle, where you go, of course you can play Befuddle in any of these decks, but none of the other decks tend to play Befuddle because Befuddle can be used on your own dock later in the game to pick your dock up and draw some more cards. But the play pattern of this deck is a turn 1 play, and then on turn 2 you play a 1-cost character and either a Befuddle or a Fire the Cannons. And what this deck is able to do better than any other deck is win while going second. And in Disney Lorcana, winning while going second is pretty difficult to do. So if you can start doing that quite consistently, the deck is just brilliant. And for me, it's the best deck in the game. It's very, very close. I think all of the Amethyst decks are really, really tight. And I think that a lot of people would disagree with me. So I do want to mention that I am quite biased towards this deck. It's a bit of a pet deck of mine. It's one that I'm quite associated with. So definitely bear that in mind. But the other great thing about this deck is it's cheap as chips. It's so affordable. Okay, the genies right now are really expensive. I'm not going to lie. From the latest set, they are not cheap by any stretch. But the rest of the deck is super affordable. And Genie and Dock are going to be cards which continue to see a lot of competitive play and therefore are good investments if you're looking to commit to Disney Lorcana. Amethyst Steel, for me, the best deck in the game. It's all about that turn 2 tempo of a well-timed Fire the Cannons or a well-timed Befuddle, which can really help you run away with it. Also, the Maleficents are necessary in order to beat Ruby Sapphire, but this deck, as it is consistently beating Ruby Sapphire 2-0, and if you play it right, it's not the easiest deck to play, I will say, and it's also favored in my experience against every other Amethyst deck in the metagame. It does have a really tough time, however, against Amber Steel Songs, in particular the Amber Steel Songs decks which play Grab Your Sword. That card can absolutely decimate your board. Having said that, the deck I'm currently playing has Snake and Pete, which gives you some really interesting opportunities. For example, you could play Pete on turn 4, either challenge or quest with Pete on turn 4, and then play a Snake and repeat and replay the Pete. That is a really powerful combo in this deck, which is why I'm currently playing 4 copies of the Snake and 4 copies of the Pete. I think it's the best deck in the game. I really, really do. But all of the decks in the A tier are great, and that's why there's no S tier deck. Up next, we've got Ruby Sapphire Control, often known as the greediest deck in Disney Lorcana. And I'm about to upset some people because everyone's expecting me to put Ruby Sapphire in the A tier. Guys, I know you're expecting me to put it in the A tier. If I am, it's going here. I'm not going to lie, guys. I'm going to put it in the B tier. I really, really am. So controversial, but guess what? I don't care. I think that Ruby Amethyst Control right now is a little bit too slow for the metagame. I think in the very best players' hands, Ruby Sapphire Control would be in the A tier, but that's in the very, very, very best players' hands. I, for me, just think it's too slow. Amethyst is everywhere right now. Even the Amber Steel Songs deck are starting to go a little bit more speedy by cutting the aerial and cutting the whole new world. I don't think that Ruby Sapphire is one of the best decks in the game right now. I think it's a solid deck which can absolutely win tournaments, but I would be really surprised to see it win the Disney Lorcana North American Championships next weekend. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong, but I have to go with my honest opinion and my gut feeling. So many of you are going to be losing your minds that I put Blurple in the same category as Ruby Sapphire, and maybe there's a chance that I look at doing this. That maybe feels a bit better, right? If I do it like that, everyone's going to probably relax a bit. Let's have a little bit of a rejiggle of the tier list and put it something like this. I'm going to put the aggro decks down into the D tier. I'm going to put the Amber Emerald in with Blurple, and I'm going to put the Ruby Sapphire deck in B tier because I think it's very close to A, but for me, it doesn't deserve to be there. And a lot of people aren't going to like that, but that's what you get with me. You get my honest, unfiltered opinion. Up next, we've got another favourite deck of mine, which is Ruby and Emerald. Now, Ruby Emerald, I haven't played this set. A problem that Ruby Emerald have, and bear in mind, I have won a set championships prize card with Ruby Emerald the past 2 sets. I got second place in the Ursula's Return, and I got a top 8 finish at the Content Creator Set Champs in Shimmering Skies, which was a stacked event, and I actually finished as first seed. Ruby Emerald, I think, is pretty underrated. It has been overshadowed a little bit by Emerald Steel, but Emerald Steel is kind of struggling at the moment. I will say that Robin Hood struggles against Elsa, which is everywhere right now. So there's definitely some different approaches you could take to Ruby and Emerald. I am sadly going to put it in the F tier for now, but I think it's a massively underrated color combination, and I could easily see it going up and doing a little bit better. But if I'm putting Bufasa in the F tier, I have to be realistic and also put the Ruby Emerald deck in there. But definitely want to keep an eye on. It's a deck I like a lot, and I will be trying to build and play a little bit more in the coming weeks for my set champs. I have to try and keep my streak alive of winning a set champs prize card with Ruby Emerald, because it is one of my favorite color combinations. Speaking of favorite color combinations, I also love Emerald Sapphire. And Emerald Sapphire actually got to the final of a last chance qualifier in the Disney Lorcana European Championships in Paris. And I was watching that deck quite avidly as I was off that day. I had rehearsals in the evening. I was able to watch a lot of the last chance qualifiers, and I watched a lot of them. But this was my favorite deck by far that I saw in the whole event, utilizing the muses to bounce back cards into your opponent's hands with songs like You're Welcome and Heffalumps and Woozles controlling the board. The blue cow, as I like to call it, is a powerhouse. You use the Fishbone Quill to empty your hand, and then a well-timed Clarabelle is just drawing you so many cards. This is one of the greediest decks in the game, one of the most underestimated decks in the game. I'm going to put it into the C tier, but definitely one I think that could be better than we realize. Up next, we've got Emerald Steel Discard. Emerald Steel Discard won so many Lorcana challenges in previous sets, but it is struggling a little bit at the moment. Perhaps partly due to the prevalence of Elsa, and also it just being quite a high rolly deck that's not that fun to play, if I'm honest. This deck is all about sticking a Diablo and singing Let the Storm Rage On. You can then discard your opponent's hand with things like Ursula and Sudden Chills. There's a couple different takes on this deck. One recently we're seeing from Zan Syed using the Seven Dwarfs Mine. I think Emerald Steel is a great deck, and when it high rolls, it can beat anything. Like when it high rolls, it's the best deck in the game. The problem is its consistency, and I think that a lot of the Amethyst decks with Genie have proven to be pretty good against this deck compared with previous sets. Having said that, I still think it absolutely belongs in one of the higher tiers, and I'm going to put it alongside Ruby Sapphire Control in the B tier. I would not be that surprised to see Emerald Steel taking down the Disney Lorcana North American Championships, because we know North America loves it. If I had to pick between which deck is better out of these two, I probably would say Ruby Sapphire, but I think it is quite a close call. 2 decks left to go, and we've got Ruby Steel up next. And this is a Ruby Steel location deck, and I want to give a huge shout out to one of my supporters on Metafy who booked a coaching session with me where we built this deck together. So a huge shout out to El Skokan, who helped me build this deck and inspired me with the idea. The general gist of it is that we're using locations, and we're also using the dock for our card draw. Ruby Steel really struggles for card draw in general, and dock is a great new addition to the deck to have a little bit of card draw. And the Moana's a really interesting one in this because we have a bunch of captains, as well as the Happy, giving Ruby Steel a couple of decent 1-cost characters, because you can move the Happy and the dock into the Seven Dwarfs Mine to deal 2 damage. And then the John Silver can also pop off and get a lot of points. You've got Gantu as a way of getting some top-end questing in. I think this deck is a really fun one, and definitely one I want to check out. But Ruby Steel continues to be one of the weakest color combinations in Disney Lorcana, and I'm going to put it straight at the bottom of F tier. But this deck, I haven't tested it. Looks so much fun, and I have full respect for anyone playing any of the decks down here. Just because I put them down here doesn't mean I'm right. Like, I put my favorite deck down here in the F tier, right? Don't be afraid to try and make things work. I'm sure you can make it work. Finally, last but never least, we have Sapphire Steel, which I've called Big Ben because Cogsworth in French is called Big Ben. And that's hilarious. So I had to call it Big Ben. Sapphire Steel did have a decent performance at the Disney Lorcana European Championships. And I think the Whole New World variant is still the best way to go. There's a lot of different setups. You can play with Whole New World, without Whole New World. For me, the Whole New World is the way to go. It's a big reason to play this color combination. You combine the Fishbone Quill with the Whole New World, and you just play nice and greedy. I think this deck's better than people realize. It's always been a deck which has been not played that much. Like, I honestly feel like it probably is a B tier deck, but because it's represented so much less than Ruby Sapphire and Emerald Steel, I am going to put it at the top of the C tier. And that rounds out my tier list. I think I'm pretty happy with this. Honestly, there's a world that Ruby Amethyst could go like here maybe, but I think I'm going to keep it here. I quite like the look of this. This is lined up quite nicely for me. I think that there's like a solid drop-off between each of them. The A tier are all pretty damn good decks. The B tier are great powerhouse decks, which have big representation, but are maybe not quite suited to the current metagame. The C tier is my pick for underrated decks, which are better than people give credit for. The D tier is for the aggro decks, because I think aggro decks are a lot better than people realize. I do feel a little bit bad about having the Ruby. I'm going to put Ruby Emerald up a tier, because I think Ruby Emerald deserves to be higher than Bufasa and Locations. I think this color combination has some legs, and you could make something pretty good with it. So that's my final little adjustment. I have to move my pet deck up a tier. And I think also the Blue Cow deck I might bump up ahead of Amber Emerald Discard as well. So my Dark Horse decks to keep an eye on moving forward are going to be Blurple, Blue Cow, and the aggro decks, because I think they're better than people realize. And also maybe Sapphire Steel. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Big shout out again to Card Market. Don't forget to subscribe. If you're wondering where my other content's going, I am posting quite a lot of content on my old YouTube channel, which is at Spessy Snap. I'm doing Gwent the Witcher card game content at the moment, and lots of other variety stuff. Anything that's not Lorcana goes up over there. So if you want to see me playing other card games and you want to check that channel out, please do go ahead and check it out. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Make sure you like it, and I'll see you all very soon indeed. Cheers.